How are you? And welcome. Let's check in with Andre first.
What a crazy week it's been. President Donald Trump announced tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. The stock market went down. Bitcoin dropped. People called Mr. Trump crazy for imposing these tariffs on our neighbors, but then Canada caved, Mexico caved, the US canceled the tariffs, and the markets went up again, and now you're all caught up. Except there's a 30-day delay on the tariffs now, and they could be coming back, so when they do, I want you to understand what's happening, because a lot of people are scared right now that this will make the price of stuff go up, but I'm here to tell you that that's not always the case. So if you're someone who's just trying to invest their money and you're trying to understand what the heck is happening, I'm going to break down the trade war, what it means for the economy, and what history tells us about similar situations. But I also want to go deeper because behind this trade war is something so much bigger: the fate of the US dollar and the possibility of something called the Plaza Accord 2.0 and what that means for stocks, real estate, Bitcoin, and your portfolio. Because the truth is, right now, on the global economic stage, there's a game of 4D chess that's being played right in front of us, and that's what I want to help explain. So let's get into it.
Cool.
Hi, my name is Andre Jick. Hope you're doing well. Come for the finance and stay for the trade war. Now, by now, you probably already realized that the United States has won the trade war between Mexico and Canada. They're already putting more agents on the border to stop organized crime and drug trafficking. And by the way, here's how you can tell which country is going to win a trade war. You can measure how much a country's paycheck relies on another country's trade. For example, Canada's exports as a percentage of their GDP with the US is 22%, and for Mexico, it's 35%. But US exports as a percentage of its overall income is 1.5% from Canada and 1.2% from Mexico, meaning Canada and Mexico rely a lot more on the US than the other way around. So in a game of chicken, the US is going to win. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions about tariffs, though, is that it leads to inflation or prices going up. Now, I'm sure you've seen those scary headlines, but they're wrong. If you ever study economics, and people like Milton Friedman, who's considered to be one of the most respected economists of all time, he said that the only entity that can create inflation is the government. No one else can make prices go up other than those who possess the power to create money.
They don't produce inflation for one simple reason. They do not own a printing press on which you can turn out green pieces of paper. Consumers don't produce it. Producers don't produce it. The trade unions don't produce it. Foreign sheiks don't produce it. Oil imports don't produce it. What produces it is too much government spending and too much government creation of money and nothing else.
Now, thankfully, we have Elon Musk and Doge, which are meticulously analyzing government spending and cutting it. And that's really good because it allows us to make the government smaller and to cut corrupt, inefficient spending, which allows the country to rely less on its citizens for income, aka taxes. So by introducing strategic tariffs and cutting government spending, it's possible for the US to lower prices and spend less on taxes. And if you want to deep dive on that, there's a video by Anthony Pompliano, which you should check out, that talks about this. There were 3 specific examples of how President Trump's 2018 tariffs actually helped create more jobs by forcing companies to make more stuff here in the US, it lowered prices, and it created more revenue for the US government. Because after the 2018 tariffs, the price of solar panels went down, the price of washing machines went down, and the price of US steel went down. The experiment was considered a success. So what we're seeing right now is a strategic use of these tariffs to get what the United States wants. It's really, really clever, but there's also a different theory about why these tariffs are actually happening. And to understand what's really going on, I want to help explain something called the Triffin Dilemma. So the Triffin Dilemma was named after Robert Triffin, who was a Belgian-American economist, and in the 1960s, he discovered a really big problem. What he found was that any country that was creating the world's reserve currency, like the US does with the dollar, faces a fundamental conflict. On one hand, the world needs more dollars to allow for global trade and to grow their economies. Cool. But on the other hand, for the US to supply these dollars, it has to run big trade deficits by importing more than it exports. And this creates a long-term problem. The more the US prints dollars and runs deficits, the more fragile the confidence in the dollar becomes. Eventually, other countries start questioning whether the US can maintain its financial stability. Now, Triffin warned that this could lead to a scenario where countries lose trust in the dollar, ultimately forcing the US to choose between providing global liquidity or protecting its own economic interests. Now, I realize how insanely complicated all that sounds, so let me give you a super easy to follow analogy. Imagine a world-famous casino where players from all over come to gamble. The casino has special chips that everybody trusts, and soon these chips become so accepted that people start using them for games outside the casino in their own personal games at home. Now, to keep the system going, the casino has to keep handing out more chips than it takes in, running at a loss, so that everyone always has enough chips to play with. But here's the catch. The more chips the casino makes and the more its debt grows, at some point, players might start wondering, are these chips worth as much as they used to be? What if other casinos make their own chips, and what if the other players actually start using them? And that's exactly what's happening with the US and the dollar. Eventually, players might stop using the US chips and switch to another casino's. Of course, in this analogy, the casino chips are the US dollars, the Las Vegas casino is the US economy, the poker players are other countries who rely on our poker chips, and the casino running at a loss is the United States running a trade deficit. But okay, hold on. Why then does the US need a trade deficit in the first place? And that's because when other countries sell us things, they get paid in dollars, but those dollars don't just sit there. Foreign governments and businesses reinvest those dollars back into US assets, buying stocks, US real estate, and treasury bonds. Now, this keeps the loop going. The US buys goods, dollars flow overseas, then those dollars come right back into our financial system. If the US suddenly stops running deficits, less dollars flow into global markets, demand for dollars drops, and suddenly the whole system starts breaking down. That's why this trade war isn't just about tariffs, it's about whether the entire financial system can keep working the way it always has been. So how do you fix it then? Just keep the players gambling, right? That's how real casinos work. Except the difference is real casinos are taking more from players than they're paying out. That's why they exist. A non-profitable casino couldn't last for very long. The United States can't run endless trade deficits without consequences, and here's why. The casino is not making enough money from players because it's giving out more chips than it takes in. That's why you see headlines like this one, that the US subsidizes Canada. We don't actually, but we kind of do in some sense. A losing casino has to borrow money to stay open. It borrows money through creating bonds. But now it owes debt to lenders, which are countries buying US debt. And because interest rates are high, it's costing the casino a lot of money to pay those players, which only works when the casino is making money, but this one isn't. So players begin to doubt whether the chips are worth what they used to be because they notice the casino keeps printing new chips out of thin air instead of making real profits. Now, to calm the players down, the US casino's like, chill, we got cool tech, stonks, ChatGPT, but then recently, another player at the casino was like, how much are those worth? Because we just recreated that tech for almost free. At some point, the casino reaches a breaking point where it has too much debt and can't keep borrowing money forever. When that happens, players start switching to other casinos that seem more stable. They form new alliances like the BRICS and create their own casinos, which makes the original casino really, really mad. And if confidence is lost in the casino's chips, their value collapses and the whole system falls apart, and we don't want that. But that's exactly what will happen if the US keeps running trade deficits and printing more dollars forever. It can't do that. As of right now, the US has to keep sending dollars overseas so that the world can use them. And one of the ways we're doing that is importing more than exporting, which keeps the dollars flowing out. And that's what you call the trade deficit. And now we're back to square one. The US has to borrow more and more money to keep up this cycle. Foreign countries collect US debt by buying and holding US Treasury bonds. The US government keeps borrowing more to fund its economy, and when it can't, it tries to raise taxes, which makes people really mad. So what's the solution? There's a couple theories on what the solutions are, like the Plaza Accord 2.0, which I'll explain. But on a personal level, I'm not going to wait around by holding cash, because in a world where the US dollar's value is being questioned and the global financial system is shifting, sitting on cash could mean losing purchasing power over time, and that's why I'm staying invested. Now, there's a couple interesting theories about what the possible solutions are, but one of the most interesting ones I found is the Plaza Accord 2.0. Here's the thing about tariffs. The market right now is freaking out because it doesn't know how long these tariffs will last, which tend to hurt it. If the US suddenly imposes tariffs to reduce trade deficits, which we just did, it could disrupt the fun of this casino. If players are charged a percentage of their winnings as they leave the casino, some players won't want to play. The strongest of players would be like, I'll just make my own casino. But the smaller neighboring players that rely on having fun here are gonna be forced to stay here. They have no choice. They might complain about it, but they'll capitulate. And what does the US casino really actually want? It wants a weaker dollar, aka a less valuable poker chip, so it can hand out more poker chips. That's the Plaza Accord 2.0. And believe it or not, this has happened in the past. The original Plaza Accord happened in 1985 when the US, Japan, Germany, France, and the UK all agreed to weaken the US dollar on purpose. The US wanted this. Why? Because a strong dollar was hurting US exports. World leaders worked together to lower its value, and this helped the US stay competitive. That's what President Donald Trump is after. He wants to create so much pressure and so much aggression, we're gonna buy your country, right? That it will open up negotiations to weaken the dollar, to reset expectations. He wanted this in his first term when he was president by pressuring Mr. Powell into lowering interest rates. But Papa Powell and Mr. Trump don't really see eye to eye all the time. Mr. Trump wants a weaker dollar so that US exports become cheaper, making American businesses more competitive. But Papa Powell, as head of the Federal Reserve, has a different goal. He's focused on keeping inflation under control. He does not care about the stock market. Inflation is his legacy, and that's why he wants interest rates higher for longer. But here's the problem. Higher interest rates make the dollar stronger because it attracts money from all over the world to be parked here, more demand for poker chips. So Mr. Trump is using tariffs not only as a weapon to create pressure and potentially slow the economy, but ultimately to force Papa Powell's hand into cutting interest rates to re-stimulate the economy. It's a classic Trump strategy. Maximum pressure, maximum chaos, and then ultimately, boom, art of the deal, weaken the dollar. So the question is, what happens to stocks and real estate and Bitcoin and all these other assets? They tend to go up. Stocks tend to benefit because lower interest rates make borrowing cheaper, which boosts growth stocks, tech stocks, and high-debt companies. And historically, stock markets prefer when the dollar is weak because companies that export goods, like Apple and Tesla, become more competitive. Real estate benefits because lower rates means cheaper mortgages. And investors that want to protect their buying power might also flood their money into hard assets, like property. Bitcoin and gold are apex predators in the domain of property. That's why gold just hit an all-time high recently. And as fiat currencies weaken, people look for alternatives that hold their value over time. That's what I think the smart investors see. I think that's a really interesting theory. Now, the real big takeaway is that on a personal level, cash is probably going to lose purchasing power in this scenario. Investors who sit on too much cash while the dollar weakens could see their savings eroded, possibly by inflation, but definitely by asset values going higher. If this theory plays out, we're looking at a future where the financial system changes in a really big way. The US could be heading toward a long-term period of lower interest rates and a weaker dollar, high growth, similar to what happened after the original Plaza Accord. And if that happens, the biggest winners will be those who hold assets. but anyone who relies on things like fixed income savings or an income that doesn't keep up with inflation will unfortunately be left behind. But all of this is, of course, allegedly for entertainment purposes only. If you found this breakdown helpful, smash the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Next, let's head over to Yahoo Finance, see what they got to say.
Well, the 10-year Treasury yield hovering around the lowest level that we've seen in just about a month, following some commentary that we got from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He spoke with Fox Business yesterday, saying that President Trump is, quote, not calling on the Fed to lower rates. They're not worried, not focused on what the Fed is doing, but rather they are focused on the 10-year Treasury yield. For more on this, I want to bring in Ed Mills. He's the managing director at Raymond James. Ed, it's great to have you back here on Yahoo Finance. So certainly some of that rhetoric and some of the comments that we got from Bessent certainly had and do continue to move the market here this morning. My question to you is, when you take into account what the administration wants to see happen, they want to see lower yields. Is that possible given the policies, especially the tariff policies that are and do seem to be coming out of the administration?
Yeah, Shauna, it's an important question. And I do think that when we look at the Hill and what they want to do on tax cuts, another really important thing that came out of that interview yesterday was a continued insistence by the Treasury Secretary that the Trump tax cuts from 2017 are going to be made permanent. To do that, that adds more than $4 trillion to the debt and deficit over the next 10 years. There is also a desire to go beyond that. No tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, overtime, changes to SALT. Now we're more than $5 trillion. If we see a bill that would add to the debt and deficit by more than $5 trillion, it is going to be a challenge to keep the long end of the curve down. One of the things that I would also look at, Shauna, is if there is something that the Treasury Secretary has some authority over versus the Fed funds rate is Treasury yields. And what we saw over the last couple of years is under the Biden administration, Treasury Secretary Yellen changing the way in which they refunded treasuries that put downward pressure on the 10-year that allowed for us to seem as if inflation was not running as hot. Can they continue that? My bet is they actually have to issue more 10-year treasuries, which will be a difficult part of keeping that lid on the long end of the curve.
And so, Ed, what are the potential offsets if this is seen as a move that would ultimately move the deficit higher?
Brad, when I've been talking to clients at Raymond James, this week in particular, we've seen a very aggressive action by Elon Musk and Doge. If bondholders think that there is going to be less government spending and a material impact on government spending, that they have a higher probability that the kind of fiscal picture of the United States is looking better. We had Donald Trump talking about the establishment of the ERS, the External Revenue Service, through the collection of tariffs. If tariff policy is going to bring in more cash to the United States government, that would be viewed as positive for bondholders. And then finally, if there are parts of the deregulatory agenda, if there is more energy exploration, that should promote economic growth. So what you would hear from the Trump team is those things in combination, Brad, would help bondholders get more optimistic about the future fiscal path of the United States, and therefore bond yields should reflect that.
And I guess my question to you is, when you take a look at Bessent's 3-3-3 plan, and a lot of what he laid out at Fox Business is very similar to what we heard from him over the last several weeks, just in terms of his priorities and what he likes or what he would want to see happen. How much of that is more so sentiment driven versus a material shift that we're going to see on inflation?
It's a to be determined situation. And I would add to that, Shauna, is sentiment is going to be driven by the process in the pace of which President Trump and his administration does things. If we get more of the tariffs, more of the kind of tax cuts early, and we're not getting that energy exploration, we're not seeing a change in energy prices, or we're not seeing the deregulation, sentiment's going to be pretty mixed on this. They are trying to use the bully pulpit of the presidency to get this done. And I think that they have a shot at this. When I've talked to investors at Raymond James, people are cautiously optimistic about the path forward this year with the market. Probably the thing that they are concerned about is the return to volatility that we've already seen. And we didn't have much volatility the last couple of years, but with the policy uncertainty brings that back to the forefront.
Ed, as you evaluate some of the kind of geopolitical uncertainty as well and the tit-for-tat tariff talk that has started to emerge as of this week and, of course, has been prioritized since the campaign trails, how do you look at some of the technological portions as political or even geopolitical pawns as a part of this, thinking about DeepSeek, thinking about TikTok, and how that could potentially continue to get ratcheted into the conversation?
So here at Raymond James, for the last 5 years, Brad, we've been talking about one of the biggest changes in U.S. policy is how we have now viewed our technology as a national security asset. That started first and foremost with semiconductors, semicap equipment that was going into China. It expanded to AI. We also expect it to expand to energy resources. Think about the critical minerals, the rare earth minerals. I'm seeing things in the Biden administration start that Trump is picking up on in his executive order, saying we need to de-risk these supply chains. I've seen things in healthcare, the biopharmaceutical concerns, active pharmaceutical ingredients. We see Trade Representative Peter Navarro talking about healthcare as this next frontier. And so for Donald Trump, if there is something that the United States has that others want, and if our enemies want it in particular, he's going to seek to restrict that and protect the U.S. position on that. And there's been market volatility tied to that. I've had so many conversations at Raymond James with semiconductor analysts. I just know I'm going to expand that group as that export controls expands in Trump 2.0, Brad.
And when you take a look at the news that we're getting out this morning here from D.C., President Trump said to meet with GOP lawmakers on this budget resolution. Time is ticking. Lots of questions about what the next couple of weeks is going to how the next couple of weeks are going to unfold, how likely it is that we are going to get any sort of resolution. You've called it the fact that we're likely on track for some sort of collision course. What does that look like? What's the fallout?
Yeah, so the first collision course that I'm looking for, Shauna, is March 14th. The government needs to be funded by March 14th. The debt limit, we've already started extraordinary measures. That needs to be dealt with. That only can be done on a bipartisan basis because you still need 60 votes in the Senate to get that done. And with the small majority in the House, there's no way, in my mind, House Republicans can coalesce over lifting the debt limit. Some of them just will never vote for that. You have a need to fund wildfires and other disaster relief. But then you have the Trump administration saying, look, what you pass in Congress is not what I am beholden to. That might be a ceiling, not a floor. And you have Elon Musk and the Doge Committee going agency to agency, looking to kind of massively cut budgets. So if you're a congressional Democrat and you're looking at these budget negotiations, why would you get a hard-fought win that can be reversed the next day by Donald Trump? And so I think the threat of a government shutdown is actually pretty high come March 14th. What we can do with the debt limit becomes in doubt. And the longer we're under the debt limit, it might be Scott Bessent's wish, because what we saw in 23 is that the longer we're under the debt limit, the more pressure was on long-term yields. Mm-hmm. But once we lifted that debt limit, we had to issue a bunch of treasuries and yields spiked higher. So it might be short-term benefits to long-term pain, and a huge distrust right now, Shauna, between congressional Democrats in this Trump administration. I'm sure it can go lower, but it's hard to see it much lower than it is right now.
I agree with you there. All right. Ed Mills, great stuff. Thanks so much for taking the time.
What's up, you guys? It's Graham here. So it finally happened. Breaking news. We now have an official outline on Donald Trump's potential tax cuts. And I gotta say, this could wind up saving most of you watching a lot of money. In fact, he just laid out 6 categories that could soon get a complete overhaul. And that's why it's crucial that we break down exactly what's outlined, what this means for you, and how much money you could see back in your pocket at the end of the day. Because no joke, this could be the biggest tax adjustment that we've seen in almost 10 years. Although really quick, if you enjoy videos like this where I just try to get you the information as fast as possible, even if that means I had to cancel plans to get you this video out on time, it would mean the world to me if you hit the like button or subscribe if you haven't haven't done that already. And as a thank you for doing that, I'll do my best to reply to as many comments as I can. So thanks so much, and also a big thank you to Incogni for sponsoring this video, but more on that later. Alright, so to start, let's just get right into it. In 2017, Donald Trump passed what's called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which lowered taxes for practically everybody across the board, reduced corporate income taxes, and provided some pretty substantial benefits for anybody who was self-employed. However, these were all scheduled to expire by the end of 2025 if nothing was done. And as I'm sure you could see, something is currently being done as we speak. Or I guess as I speak. And these are the proposed changes. According to the Wall Street Journal, Trump outlined 6 tax priorities, with the first being no tax on tips, Social Security, or overtime pay. So let's start with tips. If passed, this would either change the definition of tips so that it's not treated as income, provide a tax exemption against tips, or provide a tax deduction against tip income when a person goes and files their tax return. On top of that, most people don't realize that this was actually a proposal introduced in 2024 by Senator Ted Cruz, and in it he stated that there shall be allowed as a deduction an amount equal to the cash tips received during the taxable year that are included on statements furnished to the employer. Or basically, since that's really confusing, all that means is that if you were to get $5,000 in tips, you would get a $5,000 deduction on your tax return, and then all of a sudden, no tax owed. Now, even though this could be a huge opportunity for some workers to increase their take-home pay, I will say there are some challenges this is likely to face. For example, would non-tipped workers feel like this is unfair and want to move to a tipping income to keep more money? Or could someone self-employed structure their income as a tip to save money on taxes? Not to mention, another analysis made the argument that very few low-wage workers receive tips. 37% of tipped workers earn so little that they pay no federal income tax. And if those workers report more income, they'd potentially lose out on other tax credits. For me, I'm personally in the mindset that if this passes, we're likely to see a deduction on tips up to a certain percentage of gross income and then phasing out as you begin to make more money. Plus, let's be real, most people earning cash tips probably aren't reporting it to the IRS. So if they allow for a deduction, they're probably not going to lose that much, if any, money. And the people reporting the income could use that income towards qualifying for a loan. But beyond that, we also have the second portion, which would be no tax on Social Security. For those unaware, this is a payment given to those over the age of 62 with money that's collected through a Social Security tax of 12.4%. Essentially, those who are working today pay for those who begin collecting. And as it stands right now, Social Security income is treated exactly as it says, income. That's why 85% of Social Security benefits are taxable at the federal level. But that could soon change because Trump recently revisited his desire to eliminate federal income taxes from Social Security income. And even though this currently brings in $50.3 billion a year, the reality is half of all Social Security recipients do not pay any federal income tax on their Social Security benefits because they don't make enough money to begin with, at less than $25,000 a year. So even though this one could be pretty substantial for retirees with incomes above that amount, it's too early to tell exactly how this is going to play out, especially since the Social Security fund is already projected to run out of money by 2035, at which point anyone after that would only be collecting 85% of the promised benefits. That's why chances are, realistically, if no tax on Social Security is passed, wealthier retirees would have significantly more discretionary income, and that could be a boost to the economy. But there would eventually need to be tax increases or cuts elsewhere to be able to pay for it. So we'll have to wait and see. And finally, we have no tax on overtime pay. See, as it stands right now, if an employee works more than 8 hours in a 24-hour period, everything beyond that is treated as overtime and paid at a rate of 1.5 times. So if you make $20 an hour for the first 8 hours, everything beyond that is paid at $30. And fun fact, by the way, if you're in California, they have something called double time pay, which pays you double your pay for hours worked over 12. Anyway, as of now, all of this income is lumped together and treated at the exact same tax rate. But by removing taxes on overtime, this could be a huge incentive and boost for workers to take on more hours. And as Trump says, the people who work overtime are among the hardest working citizens in our country, and for too long, no one in Washington has been looking out for them. Of course, this would come at a cost of $1.7 trillion trillion of lost tax revenue over 10 years. But if Doge can successfully cut down on government spending, then I see no reason why this lost revenue would even matter, especially when they've already saved over $1 billion a day. Now, personally, in terms of what I think of this, I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of fine print, because the fact is, a lot of employees are salaried, so this probably isn't going to affect them. The other issue is that a lot of companies don't want to pay their workers overtime. They cap their hours at 8, and then they hire someone else to come in at the normal rate to avoid spending the extra money. So we'll have to wait and see exactly how this plays out. Kind of like the next one, which could be pretty big. Alright, so now let's discuss the next potential category, and that would be renewing the 2017 tax cuts. This means the top tax bracket's going to remain at 37% instead of the previous 39.6%. Those amounts would more or less be adjusted to inflation every year, and we're going to get another round of 2017 tax cuts that were fantastic for business owners. For example, that allowed a 20% pass-through deduction for business owners who operated an LLC or a corporation. It doubled the estate tax exemption to now $28 million, and it allowed 100% bonus depreciation in the first year for business use, meaning if you bought a plane or a heavy piece of machinery, you could use 100% of the cost of that item as a deduction in the first year, even if you only put 10% down. That meant a lot of money left over for business owners if they knew what to spend their money on and how to do their taxes. The way I see it, this is going to be the easiest for Donald Trump to pass through Congress, because it really just keeps everything exactly as it has been for the last 8 years without any real changes. But in terms of what else he has planned, a few people could actually see their taxes go up substantially depending on which business they work in. So you're going to want to hear this. Although before we go into that, let's talk about another somewhat controversial one, the salt cap deduction. Here's the thing, salt isn't just granulized sodium chloride. Instead, it stands for state and local taxes. This encompasses things like your state income tax, property tax, or any other taxes you pay within your specific city. And prior to 2017, this amount was completely deductible against your federal income taxes. As an example, let's just say you made $100,000 but paid $10,000 for state taxes and $10,000 for property taxes. In that case, you could deduct $20,000 against your income, and all of a sudden, you're taxed as though you've only made $80,000. But not anymore. Starting in 2018, the maximum amount that you would be able to deduct is $10,000 for all state and local taxes, not adjusted to inflation. And that meant that residents in states like California, New York, and New Jersey were hit especially hard, because all of a sudden, a big portion of their income was no longer deductible. In fact, I know plenty of people who actually ended up paying more money under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, even though they got tax cuts elsewhere. However, it was just announced that he plans to adjust the salt cap deduction, which I think means we'll probably see a slightly more elevated rate than we did before. This is really good for people living in high income tax states, but his other policies could be really bad for some people who make money in certain industries, as you're about to see. Like number 4, eliminate tax breaks for billionaire sports team owners. Now, I'll admit, this is something I really wasn't familiar with until I started looking into it, and wow, it's really insane. Like, have you ever noticed how it's become really popular for billionaires to buy sports teams? I always thought, beyond a certain point, what else could you spend your money on? So you may as well buy a sports team. But as it turns out, that's just the tip of the iceberg. To start, when somebody buys a business, they could use the cost of the business to deduct against their personal income. And if the loss is great enough, that could be carried forward into future years. Well, guess what happens when someone buys a billion-dollar sports business? Exactly, a potential billion-dollar write-off. Now, normally, this rule is meant to help business owners offset the cost of materials, equipment, and buildings that degrade and wear down over time. But in sports, you don't have those concerns, and most of your money is made through advertising, which isn't going to spring a water leak or have machinery become obsolete when it gets too old. In fact, ProPublica published an article detailing how the Clippers reported a $700 million loss on paper, despite being very profitable through cash flow. Now, whether or not this is clever accounting or immoral tax avoidance is really in the eye of the beholder, but Trump wants to get rid of it, and I have a feeling in the future, deductions in sports teams are going to be a lot more limited. Just like another one that's rather extraordinary, the carried interest loophole. This essentially allows private equity, venture capitalists, or hedge fund managers to treat their income as long-term capital gains instead of as ordinary income. And as you're about to see, that difference is massive. Like, just consider that a hedge fund could take a 2% management fee and take 20% of profits from investment returns. In this case, if they have $1 billion under management and turn that into $1.2 billion, that is $60 million of income for the hedge fund. Except it's not really income. See, as the current law is written, since those proceeds are technically investment returns, that's able to be taxed at a long-term capital gains tax rate of 20% plus a 3.8% net investment tax for a total of 23.8%, compared to the 37% income tax rate for earned income. That savings adds up to a significant amount of money, especially when those people aren't even risking their own capital. Now, in fairness, this is not the first time the carried interest loophole is up on the chopping block. It's been heavily discussed for years, and every single time, any measures to quash it seem to fall through. But this time could be different, and it's long due for an overhaul, just like our next topic, and that would be tax cuts on products made in America. When it comes to this one, it's still in the beginning stages, and it's unclear exactly how this would work, but my guess is that this would provide some tax breaks for companies who manufacture their products domestically, or it could provide an incentive for customers to purchase locally made goods and services. This one is admittedly a bit vague, so we'll have to wait and see what happens over the next few weeks. Now, even though all of this sounds pretty good, keep in mind that at this point, it's just a proposal. Or I guess strong suggestion, and it still has to go through a lengthy process to go into effect. Like first, the bill has to formally be drafted by the House of Representatives. In there, the bill is going to be discussed, debated, changed, and then they vote by majority rule on whether or not it's strong enough to go on to the next step. The Senate. They're going to argue way more, they'll take way more time, and they're going to dissect and tear apart every word to clear any misinterpretations. After that, a new draft is created, and if it passes the Senate, it goes back to the House of Representatives for another vote. From there, if they pass it, it goes to the president, who could sign off for final approval, or if he vetoes it, it goes back to the Senate, who could pass it still with a 2/3 vote. Basically, think of it like this. Remember when you were a kid and you'd come up with some crazy idea with your friend, and then you'd go to your friend's parents, pitch the idea, and if they say yes, then you could go to your parents and say, hey, we came up with this idea, their parents said yes, so you should say yes too. Well, that's basically the same thing that happens here, except with Congress and your entire livelihood. Now, in terms of all of this actually passing, it's a good chance because Republicans currently have the majority control of both the House and the Senate. So we're probably going to see a watered down version of everything we discussed potentially going into effect as soon as 2026. We're obviously going to have to stay tuned to see exactly what happens, but if you want to keep updated on this, please feel free to subscribe. I will do my best to update you anytime there's news. Thank you so much for watching. As always, remember to hit the like button and subscribe.